Welcome back everyone. Today I am going to summarize and review The Free Voice by Ravish Kumar. This book reflects upon free speech and the condition of Indian democracy and the author's personal musings on related issues. The author, Ravish Kumar, is a renowned journalist with NDTV. He is also the winner of Raman Magsaysay Award, which is also known as the Nobel Prize of Asia. It has been translated from Hindi to English by three persons, by Chitra Padmanabhan, by Anurag Basnet and by Ravi Singh. The name of the Hindi edition is Bolna Hi Hai. Let's get into the book now. The book opens with the story of Judge Loya. If you remember, he is the same judge of a special CBI court who was trying Amit Shah for Sohrabuddin fake encounter case. Ravish tells that he was shaken when the caravan broke out this story. He had a story which he wanted to cover. A case where a judge died under extremely suspicious circumstances and nobody stood up for his family, not even the Chief Justice of India or the Prime Minister of India provided any reassurance. He says that this is the way of striking fear in the hearts of everyone. If it can happen to a judge, it can happen to anybody. Then he says that he too felt fear while covering this story. He says that he covered this story in his show Prime Time so that the judge's family would not say tomorrow that their family member possibly was murdered under suspicious circumstances and nobody spoke out. He says that he was very scared while reading out this story on television, but he found release from the fear that had held him in its suffocating grip for 2 days. After the show ended, his phone started to buzz incessantly. Every person on the other end was threatening him. He felt like he would not reach home. He then talks of his well-wishers, how even they tell him, "Aren't you afraid? Take care of yourself." He says that these exhortations to keep safe make people cowards. He says so because these are not warnings to keep safe but to not speak at all. He then talks about how power knows how one should be removed from the path of its onward march and when. He talks about how government had punished NDTV for speaking out and he had to bid farewell to his colleagues of 20 years. These people felt that it was because of Ravish that the government had punished the organization. He then talks about WhatsApp University, where just anything is said and believed by so many people as gospel. He talks about one such revelatory episode. He says that he, along with Rajdeep Sardesai, Rana Ayub, Sagarika Ghosh and Barkha Dutt are regularly declared anti-national and traitors on social media. Then he talks about a story. The episode goes like this. He was doing a series on jobs and the condition of employment prospects for youth in India. After he had done some episodes of that series, he received a phone call from Rahul, a young man. He said that he had called him to apologize. He told him that he had talked about jobs which no one else had done. He told him that he was convinced by the local members of Bajrang Dal that he was anti-Hindu, anti-national and anti-Modi and that he was a communist and he had an annual package salary of 1 crore plus perks. Rahul also told him that he was also taught to hate Muslims and had filled with the poison of communalism. He says that such fake news and propaganda against him makes him feel unsafe in public. He tells that men have chased him sometimes with sticks in hand. Some have grabbed him by the collar. He has been punched and shoved. All this because this WhatsApp University spreads all kinds of fake news about him. Not just him, but so many people have been demonized by BJP and their troll armies. He says that there is a climate of fear and suspicion even among those who we believe are very powerful. He says that call any of these so-called powerful people and they will say, "Hang on, not over the phone, I'll call you on WhatsApp." Talk to any official and he thinks that his minister is tapping his phone. Talk to any minister and he thinks that his senior party leader or some senior minister is tapping his phone. Journalists also feel that their conversations are being listened to. Do we really want to live in a surveillance state of this kind? The state has to respect our privacy. He says, and I quote, "If politics transforms society to such an extent that calls the dissenter a traitor, putting a barbed wire of intimidation between itself and citizens, then it is a form of violence too." He then talks about crackdown on dissent under Modi government by invoking various provisions like sedition and UAPA. He says, "It isn't easy to speak out against power. Before you speak, you will have to choose between jail and amputation or a lynching. For a mob has no fear of law. Then he talks about the new culture of news anchors swarming like fearsome attackers all over those who ask questions. He says that the common viewer of TV channels sees this and starts losing confidence. He can see what becomes of those who raise questions. In this way, an atmosphere of fear is perpetuated among the masses. He further says that the status of second-class citizenry has fallen not just to the minority community, but the act of questioning the government itself can transform you into a minority, no matter you are a Hindu or Muslim. He also advises that if you want to raise questions and be credible, then you yourself should be honest. Then those in power have nothing against you. He also talks about how politicians do all the bad things but expect you to treat them like humans. He says, and I quote, "He who is in the dominating position of power decides the rule of morality. He might himself be immoral, but will request you to stick to the principles of morality and ethics. That too is one of the conditions of speaking out, so keep gathering maximum points on morality. Stick to the ethics at all times, keep your life clean and uncluttered, and keep speaking out." Then he talks about how even Prime Minister Narendra Modi is involved in spreading fake news. He talks about 2017 Gujarat elections when he accused former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh of rigging Gujarat elections because he had met High Commissioner of Pakistan, former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, along with former Vice President of India Hamid Ansari. He didn't mention that a former Chief of Staff, Mr. Deepak Kapoor, was also present there. He said that they all had, in a collaborative way, they wanted to establish a Muslim, Ahmed Patel, as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. Now, you see, he was talking about all of these conspiracy theories, and he did won that election by a narrow majority. By, talking about things that were not about development or that were not about people, but by spreading these fake news and conspiracy theories. He, in a way, accused all these people who had served India in such high positions of treason. And a lot of section of media started to report it as something suspicious, undermining the integrity of all these people from the opposition and the army. Ravi says that manufacturing of fake news is a high-skill job because it involves exploiting people's half-baked knowledge about something. He says fake news engenders fake debates and fake politics. It diverts people from real issues. Citizens keep wondering about trying to have their problems addressed, and political leaders hand them fake news and conspiracy theories and make mockery of their lives. Then he talks about mainstream TV media. The media has now begun to present communal attitudes as valid, legitimate, and is starting to brand them as nationalism. He analyzes that fake news is not only an alternative to news, it is also the means by which an alternative citizenry is being created, a gathering of people who are fed false information and polarizing impressions that amplify and legitimize their prejudices. These people are freed from the burden of thinking themselves, and they become like a mob, and their political behavior is like that of a robot. He calls these kind of people robo-public. Then he also talks about the prime targets of WhatsApp University. Yes, you guessed it. I think that everybody knows that Jawaharlal Nehru is the prime target of troll armies on WhatsApp University. He also, then talks about the kind of fake news that has been spread about him. First, Jawahar is a word borrowed from Arabic. No Kashmiri Brahmin will give his son an Arabic name. Second, Nehru's grandfather was called Ghiyasuddin Ghazi. He was a police officer during the Mughal era and he renamed himself Gangadhar Nehru. Third, that Nehru was born in a red light district in Allahabad. Fourth, that Nehru impregnated a Catholic nun. The church sent the nun out of India, for which Nehru remained grateful to the church all his life. Fifth, that Nehru had died of AIDS. He also talks about when information on Wikipedia pages of Jawaharlal Nehru and Motilal Nehru were changed. The Times of India had also reported that these edits on Wikipedia originated from an IP address that belonged to the government of India. Then he talks about a fundamental change that is happening in the society, which we can also see. The change being Indian society is becoming more and more communal. Even if everybody does not lynch each other. They have an increased hate for each other. He tells a real story of what happened with his friend. His friend and his friend's mother were traveling in a train, and she was conservative, so she was wearing a burqa. A mob formed instantly and spewed taunts at them during the whole duration of the journey. Now the question is, did these people say anything to these people that they started to taunt them and intimidate them? No, they did not. But the answer to this is that people in India today are being communalized in such a way that they are being trained to harass people, even lynch people based on their religion and their identity. You and I need to think about the kind of destruction and mistreatment and harassment that is caused to the mental state of these people. People will certainly start to live in fear. They fear being attacked anytime by anyone. This goes against the basic principle of liberty enshrined in India's constitution's preamble and the fundamental rights that are guaranteed to us. Then he talks about the attacks and the killings of journalists in India who speak truth to the power and sometimes whose voices are not liked by the government. He says that personally for him it becomes extremely difficult and unsafe to report from the ground now, especially after demonetization. You never know who might attack you. He says that you can't travel with a squad of special protection group that these politicians have with them. He also talks about an attack on journalist Basit Malik and the assassination of Gauri Lankesh, who was the editor of Lankesh Patrike. He says that the journalists had gathered for solidarity meetings after these incidents of violence, but many of the journalists choose to stay away. He says, and I quote, "It is a warning sign when an assault on a colleague leaves you unmoved, for it means that even the basic spirit of solidarity is lost to us." Then he ventures into history in the next chapter and talks about Hitler's Germany, and media silence in Germany that ultimately emboldened Hitler to do whatever he did in the history. Broadly, he talks about the important role that the media can play as the fourth pillar of a democracy and hold the government accountable for its actions and inactions. Then he says, and I quote, "To prevent anybody from speaking is a form of terrorism too. To create an atmosphere of fear and suspicion is a form of terrorism." He then talks about the lack of awareness among citizens of this country as to what being a citizen in a democracy mean and what they can do to make sure that the government is accountable to them. He talks about the Surat traders who were on a strike in Gujarat. They sang Sai bhajans instead of raising slogans like Zindabad, Murdabad, which are quite common in a democracy and which attracts the government's attention because no government likes criticism. But because they were singing Sai bhajans and were not criticizing the government, this protest had no impact at all. They were ignored by finance ministers and this protest was a total failure. Now he says, and I quote, "In reality, their inability to see themselves as citizens was the sole reason for their campaign's failure." Then he talks about the culture of Dhongi Babas in India, where they loot people with their smartness and say all kind of things. I think you should read this chapter yourself to understand it much better. Then he talks about love. And honestly, I had not expected that he would be talking about such an issue. And his thoughts are really incredible. And let's see what he says. He says that not everyone has the courage to love in India. In India, love exists only in most people's imagination. He says, to love in India, one has to battle with innumerable strictures imposed by the society. He asks, how many parents ask their children, is there anyone special in your life? Or do you like someone? Then he talks about a lot of Hindi movies to make some points. One of the points is, he says, countless stories of Hindi cinema have put love at the service of status quo. Whereas in love, you simply can't be status quoist. You have to first vault over caste. He says, in our politics too, one can't imagine a love that smashes the barriers of caste or religion. There are so many politicians who are Hindus, but they are married to Muslims, or who are Muslims but are married to Hindus. But they don't, talk about it publicly because they know that their voters would not like it and they would not accept it. They don't want to invite their voters' displeasure. But is our society really like this? Yes, it is. But it is in exactly such a society that possibilities emerge for revolutionary love, he says. People bring down the walls of caste and religion. Sometimes they do so and they survive. He also then shares stories of boys and girls in love who were victims of honor killings in India because of the simple reason that they loved someone from another caste or another religion. Then he says something that I don't think anybody has ever said in India. He advocates for separate and special places for lovers. He says there may be parks in India, but these parks are also occupied by old people who sit in the parks and talk with each other, gossip. Some other people who come there to jog for exercises, right? Then he also talks about, how people stare at lovers in these parks. He says that they just don't want you to be with each other because they themselves have not experienced love in their life. They will, start staring at you if you will just start talking about something with your lover, and there will be a vendor who will ask you if you want these chips or you want tea. They just won't let you talk. He says that if he were a neta, he would have built love parks in every city and happily lost the next election because people in India would not have approved of this venture of his. He says, and I quote, "If you are never possessed by the madness to look for hours into another's eyes, then what really have you seen?" Lastly, he talks about a 9-judge bench Supreme Court judgment, which is Justice Puthuswamy judgment, the privacy judgment, where it was unanimously declared by a 9-judge bench that privacy is a fundamental right. The government had argued in court that Aadhaar, which takes away the privacy of citizens, was not exactly an important issue because a poor person wanted subsidies and welfare schemes much more than they wanted privacy. The court ruled that the government is not doling out charity to poor people in the name of subsidies. It provides subsidies because it is answerable to the people and is responsible for their welfare. In return, it cannot take away rights from them. Then he says, and I quote, "The Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court has a clear message for the citizens. You are entirely within your rights to question and criticize the government. In fact, by making a continuous practice of it, you strengthen Indian democracy." So all in all, the author is a person who knows a lot about Indian democracy and understands it very well. He also has the brevity and eloquence to articulate his thoughts and opinions, which are very enlightening for the readers. I'd recommend this book 100% to everyone. It is a short book, I think 150-160 pages, and the language of the book is simple, I guess, and everybody can understand it. And it is not just a non-fiction book, so it is not that it is a boring book. It is a very interesting book. I read it in a very short period because it was so interesting, and I would recommend everybody should read this book to understand exactly what exactly is happening in this country, right? This was my summary and book review for The Free Voice by Ravish Kumar. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Cases are rising. Stay safe.